She arrived in Black Ridge with frostbitten fingers, an empty stomach, and a name she no longer used. 6 brothers. One abandoned ranch. A winter that wanted to kill everything it touched. Maeve Ashcroft had survived too much to believe in luck. But when Garrick Rowan offered her work instead of questions, she took it, knowing full well that kindness from strangers had always been the most dangerous thing in her world. What happened next would shake an entire valley to its roots. If you're watching this from wherever you are, drop your city in the comments below and hit that like button. Let's see how far this story travels. The cold that settled over the Black Ridge territory in the winter of 1887 was not the kind that merely made a person uncomfortable. It was the kind that got inside your thinking. It slowed your decisions, narrowed your judgment, made you stupid in ways you didn't notice until it was too late. Old-timers who'd lived through a dozen frontier winters said they'd never seen anything like it. The way the temperature dropped so hard and so fast in late October that the creek behind the Tilson Mill froze solid before anyone had finished their fall harvest. Animals died in the fields. Pipes burst in every building in town. And a woman who had been walking for 3 weeks through the kind of terrain that didn't appear on any map stumbled into the settlement on a Tuesday morning, looking like something the wilderness had tried to swallow and then given up on. Her name was Maeve Ashcroft, though she hadn't used that name out loud in almost 2 years. She came in from the Northwest Pass, which most people in Black Ridge considered impassable after the first hard frost. The fact that she'd made it through on foot, with a canvas pack that weighed maybe 15 pounds, and boots that had started separating at the left sole, told a certain story about how desperate she'd been to get somewhere, anywhere, before the cold finished what it had started. She was 31 years old, though she looked older that morning. Her face was wind-scoured and lean, her dark hair pulled back in a knot that had come half undone somewhere in the mountains, and her coat, a man's coat, too large in the shoulders and fraying at the cuffs, had one button missing near the middle. She walked into Black Ridge the way a person walks when they've stopped trusting their own legs, but haven't got anything else to trust instead. Careful. A little stiff. Eyes that moved before her feet did, checking every doorway and every face before she committed to a direction. The settlement itself wasn't much to look at. A main street with maybe 14 buildings on it, half of them needing paint. A general store with a hand-lettered sign that someone had partially repaired after the wind took a corner of it. A livery stable, a post office that also served as the land office on alternate Thursdays, and a saloon called the Brass Kettle that opened at noon and closed whenever Deke Halloran, the owner, decided he'd had enough of people. 3 side streets running off the main one, and beyond those, the wide flat reach of the valley that in summer was grassland and in December was just brown and gray and relentless. Maeve stood at the edge of the main street for a full minute before she moved again. A woman named Hetty Burrows, who ran the general store with her husband Percy, saw her from the window and later described it to anyone who'd listen as looking like a person deciding whether or not to trust a bridge. Which wasn't an unfair description. Maeve had learned at considerable cost that places that looked stable often weren't, and that the moment you stopped watching for signs of trouble was usually the moment it arrived. She went into the general store because she needed to, not because she wanted to. Percy Burrows was behind the counter. He was a short man with a broad forehead and the kind of permanent squint that comes from years of reading small print in bad light. He looked up when she came in, took in the coat and the pack and the condition of her boots, and his expression did the small, involuntary thing that people's expressions did when they were making calculations about what they were looking at. "Morning," he said. "Morning." She set her pack down carefully next to the door. "I'm looking for work. Anything temporary? Cleaning, hauling, whatever needs doing. I've got maybe $2 and I'd rather spend it on food than lodging, so if anyone in town needs a hand, I'd appreciate knowing." Percy looked at her for a moment. "You come through the Northwest Pass?" "I did. In this weather?" "Yes." He seemed to weigh something. "There's not much in town that'd pay. The Yardley brothers are done for the season, and most folks are just trying to hold on till spring." He paused. "You might try the Rowan Ranch, about 4 miles south. Garrick Rowan runs it with his brothers. There's 6 of them altogether. They've been short-handed since their last hired man quit in September. I don't know what he pays, but he pays." "6 brothers," Maeve said. "They're decent men," Percy said, and his tone suggested he was answering a question she hadn't asked yet. She bought dried beans, a small piece of salt pork, and a box of matches. The total came to 63 cents. She thanked him and left. The road to the Rowan Ranch was not a road in any precise sense of the word. It was two wheel ruts pressed into the frozen ground, running south from the edge of town through scrubland that gave way, eventually, to open pasture. The wind came at her sideways for most of the walk, and by the time the ranch buildings came into view, her left hand had gone past cold into the particular numbness that felt almost comfortable, which she knew was not a good sign. The ranch was larger than she'd expected. The main house was a long, low structure built from timber and stone, with a covered porch running the full length of the front. There were 3 outbuildings, a barn, a smaller equipment shed, and what looked like a bunkhouse with smoke coming from the chimney, and a series of fenced pastures stretching away to the east. The whole place had the look of something that had once been well tended and had since fallen behind. Fence rails needed replacing. The porch had a slight sag at one end. The gate she passed through hung at an angle that suggested one of the hinges had been repaired with something improvised. She knocked on the front door. The man who opened it was tall, well over 6 feet, with the kind of face that didn't give away much. Dark hair, a jaw that needed a razor's attention, and eyes the color of creek water in autumn, somewhere between gray and brown depending on the light. He was wearing a work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows despite the cold, and he looked at her the way people in hard places learn to look at strangers. Not unfriendly, but not open either. "Garrick Rowan," she said. "That's right. My name is Maeve. Percy Burroughs in town said you might be looking for help." He looked at her for a moment, not in the way some men looked at women, assessing in ways that made her want to step back, but the way a person looks when they're trying to figure out how much of what they're hearing is the truth. It was a fair look, she thought. She'd have done the same. "Come in," he said. "You look like you're about 10 minutes from frostbite." She stepped inside. The main room was large and crowded in the way that rooms get when too many people live in them without anyone managing the chaos. There were boots near the door, at least 8 pairs in various states of mud and repair. Coats hung on pegs along one wall. A long table ran down the middle of the room with benches on either side, and at that table, in various states of activity or rest, sat 5 more men. They ranged in age from what looked like mid-20s to somewhere around 40, and they all had the same general quality as Garrick: big, work-worn, faces that had been outside in all kinds of weather. They looked up when she came in with the collective expression of men who didn't get many visitors. "This is Maeve," Garrick said, with no further explanation. "She's looking for work." A silence settled over the table. Not hostile, exactly. More like everyone was waiting to see who would speak first. The youngest-looking one, with red-brown hair and a gap between his front teeth that showed when he smiled, said, "You walked from town?" "From the Northwest Pass, actually," she said. That produced a reaction. Several of the brothers exchanged a look that she couldn't quite read. "Sit down," Garrick said. "Have you eaten today?" "I'm fine." "That wasn't what I asked." She sat down. His name was Garrick, and the others, moving around the table and the kitchen with the practiced randomness of people who've lived together a long time, were Callum, Bram, Theo, Niall, and the youngest, whose name was Seb, and who was 23 and made no secret of the fact that he found everything slightly more interesting than anyone else did. Callum was the one closest to Garrick in age, maybe 38, and had a quietness that felt less like shyness and more like someone who'd decided a long time ago that most conversations didn't require his participation. Bram talked more than any of them, and Theo had a habit of starting sentences and then stopping halfway through as if he'd changed his mind about the point he was making. Niall was somewhere in the middle. Steady, practical, not unfriendly, but not eager either. They fed her. Garrick put a bowl of stew on the table in front of her without asking whether she wanted it, and Seb added a piece of bread and then pulled it back and added a bigger piece because the first one had looked small. She ate carefully, the way a person eats when they've been hungry long enough that eating too fast makes them sick, and nobody made a production of watching her do it, which she appreciated more than she could have said. The job, Garrick explained, was general work. The ranch ran about 200 head of cattle and had about 400 acres under management, though a good portion of that was currently frozen solid and not requiring much attention. What it did require was someone who could cook, keep the house in some kind of order, help with mending and supplies, and generally manage the domestic side of things that had fallen apart since their last hired hand. A man named Orel, who'd cooked and kept house for 3 years, had left suddenly in September to go back east to care for his mother. "What we've been eating since Orel left," Seb said, "is a tragedy." "Seb," Garrick said, "it's true. Bram made something last week that he called soup." "It had ingredients in it," Bram said, with the tone of a man defending something he knew was indefensible. "Ingredients," Seb said, "floating in water." Maeve looked at the pot on the stove, which was currently sitting empty but showed evidence of serious use. "I can cook," she said. "I can manage a household. I've done it before." "Where?" Callum asked. It was the first word he'd said since she'd come in. She looked at him. "Different places," she said. "I've moved around." He didn't push it. She noted that. Garrick offered her the room in the main house that had been Orel's, a small space off the kitchen with a window that looked out toward the eastern pasture. The pay was modest but fair. She would have room and board included, which in these conditions was not a small thing. She told him she needed to think about it. She didn't, actually. She'd already decided. But she'd learned that agreeing to things too quickly made people curious about why you'd agreed, and she was not in a position to answer many questions about the preceding 2 years of her life. She said yes the next morning. The first 2 weeks were the strangest she'd spent in a long time, and not for any reason she'd been prepared for. She'd expected the brothers to be difficult, or at minimum indifferent, or to have assumptions about what it meant to have a woman living and working in their household that she'd have to address in one way or another. She'd dealt with all of those things before. She knew how to handle them. What she didn't know how to handle was the absence of them. The Rowan brothers were, as nearly as she could tell, simply people. They had disagreements. Bram and Theo had some ongoing argument about a fence line that apparently dated back at least 3 years. And Callum and Seb had the low-grade tension of people who'd been living in each other's pockets for too long. But they weren't cruel, they weren't grabbing, and they didn't treat her like a curiosity or a problem to be managed. Garrick paid her on Friday mornings without comment. Seb occasionally offered to show her where things were kept before she asked. Niall, who turned out to be the one with the most practical knowledge of the ranch's operations, answered her questions about the property without making her feel like the questions were an imposition. It unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. The house itself was in a state that she understood immediately. It wasn't dirty exactly. The brothers kept it clean enough in the way that men who live without supervision keep things clean, meaning the floors got swept when they started crunching underfoot and the dishes got washed before they ran out of clean ones. But it had lost whatever warmth it might once have had. The curtains in the main room were gray with dust. The kitchen had a smell that suggested the chimney needed clearing. There were things piled in corners that had been piled there long enough to have stopped being noticed. She started with the kitchen, because the kitchen was where a house's livability began and ended. The first morning, she cleared the chimney, reorganized the pantry, discovering in the process that there were actually adequate stores for the winter if managed correctly, which apparently none of them had thought to check, and made biscuits from scratch because the flour was fine and she needed something to do with her hands. When the brothers came in for morning chores, there were biscuits on the table and coffee that had been made with attention instead of just hope. Seb picked up a biscuit, took a bite, looked at Maeve, and looked at it again. "Where have you been?" he said, with the tone of a man who had suffered our entire lives. "Seb," Garrick said, "I mean it, as a compliment." She found herself, briefly, on the edge of something that wasn't quite a smile. She suppressed it. By the third week, she had established enough of a routine that it felt almost like something she could depend on, which was the thing that worried her most. She woke before the brothers, started the stove, and had coffee going before anyone else was moving. She'd worked out what each of them preferred for breakfast. Callum and Niall wanted something plain and filling. Bram would eat anything but needed quantity. Theo had a preference for eggs if they had them, and Seb would eat whatever was in front of him with equal enthusiasm, regardless of quality. Garrick ate last, usually, because he was always the last in from the morning check of the animals, and he ate whatever was left with the same concentration he brought to everything else. She noticed that about him, the concentration. He didn't do things halfway, or with the distracted efficiency she'd seen in most of the men she'd worked for in her life. When he spoke to her, he paid attention to what she said. When she raised a question about the household supplies or something she'd noticed on the property, he listened before responding. It made her careful around him in a way she hadn't been careful around the others. The fourth week, she fixed the fence that had been causing the argument between Bram and Theo, not because it was her job, but because she'd walked past it twice and couldn't stop thinking about it. It turned out the dispute was about a corner post that had rotted at the base, and both of them had been arguing about whose responsibility it was to replace it, rather than just replacing it. She dug out the rot, set a new post, and wired the rails back in place on a Thursday afternoon while most of the brothers were out working the far pasture. When Bram found out, he looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely interpret. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "Theo's going to feel embarrassed." "Only if you tell him I did it." Bram considered this. "What do I tell him then?" "Tell him you found a moment between things and took care of it." He was quiet for a second. "Why would you do that for him?" She thought about this. The honest answer was that she wasn't sure exactly. Some part of it was that she'd learned how to keep peace in a house, and keeping peace sometimes meant absorbing friction that didn't have to exist. But some part of it was something she didn't want to examine too carefully, which was that she'd started, without permission and without intending to care slightly whether the Rowan household functioned well. "He seems like he's carrying enough already," she said. Bram didn't say anything to that, but he didn't tell Theo it was him who'd fixed the fence either. Besek. The trouble with Black Ridge itself arrived, as it usually did in small settlements, in the form of other people's mouths. She'd gone into town twice since arriving at the ranch. Once for supplies, once because Garrick had needed a document notarized at the land office, and she'd had reason to go with him. Both times she'd felt the town watching. Not everyone, and not openly, but in the particular way of small places where strangers don't remain strangers, and people have more time to speculate than they have things to speculate about. The first real indication came through Seb, who'd ridden into town for nails and come back with a different energy than he'd left with. "People are talking," he said at dinner. It was not addressed to anyone in particular. "People always talk," Bram said, "about Maeve." The table went quiet. She kept eating. "What are they saying?" Garrick said. His voice hadn't changed, but something in it had. Seb looked at his plate. The usual kind of stupid thing, about what it means that she's living here, with all of us. A silence stretched out. She was aware of all of them choosing, in that moment, how to respond to it. "That's their business," Callum said finally. "People can say what they want." "It's not fair to her," Niall said. "No," Callum agreed. "It's not." She looked up from her plate. "I've been talked about before," she said, "and by people a good deal more creative than anyone in Black Ridge, from what I can tell." She looked at Seb. "It doesn't require an apology." "I wasn't apologizing," Seb said. "I was just telling me," she said. "I know, that was decent of you." He seemed slightly at a loss, which was not his usual state. Garrick said nothing that night, but the next morning, before he left for the day's work, he stopped in the kitchen where she was washing the breakfast dishes and said, "If it gets to the point where you can't walk into town without it being a problem, tell me." She looked at him. "And then what?" "And then I'll go with you." It was a simple thing to say. It shouldn't have landed as heavily as it did. She turned back to the dishes so he wouldn't see whatever was happening in her face. "That's not necessary," she said. "Probably not," he agreed. "But I meant it." The cold in December was a different animal from the cold in November. November cold was the kind you worked against. You moved faster. You layered more. You kept your hands busy and your blood moving, and it was unpleasant but manageable. December cold was the kind that stopped being about discomfort and started being about attrition. It wore at things. It wore at fences and at animals and at the skin of your hands and at the particular kind of patience required to keep going when the weather suggested that stopping was the more reasonable option. She watched it wear at the brothers in ways they didn't seem to notice themselves. Niall's sleep got shorter. She could hear him moving around before 4 in the morning on the nights when the wind was bad. Callum developed a roughness in his breathing that she suspected was the start of something chest-related but that he said nothing about. Bram's appetite, which had been prodigious, started declining in the second week of December in a way that might have been stress or might have been illness. Theo, who had taken on the largest part of the work of maintaining the herd during the worst weather, came in from the pasture at the end of each day looking slightly less like himself than he had that morning. She adjusted for this without mentioning it, The soup she made in December was heavier than the soup she'd made in November. More root vegetables, more bone broth, proportionally more fat because the body needed it in sustained cold. She added dried herbs she found in the pantry that no one had touched since Oral left, which lifted the flavor and also, for reasons she didn't examine closely, seemed to lift the mood of the room when people came in from outside and smelled it. She made sure the fire in the main room was built up before dark each evening. She set out extra blankets on the bench near the door where the brothers would find them when they came in half frozen and not particularly capable of thinking about where blankets were kept. None of them said much about any of it. Garrick said once, "You're keeping this place together." And it was neither a compliment nor a complaint, just an observation, the way he observed things. "So are you," she said. "You're just doing your part outside." He looked at her for a moment. "That's a fair way to put it," he said. There were things she didn't say. She didn't tell them why she'd left wherever she'd been before. She didn't tell them about the man in Billings who had her name on a paper that he used to mean something it didn't mean anymore, not legally, but the law was sometimes slower to catch up with what was real than the man himself was. She didn't tell them about the 6 months she'd spent in Cheyenne under a different name, working in a hotel kitchen that had paid fairly but required a kind of vigilance she found exhausting. She didn't tell them about the thing that had happened in the spring, which was the reason she'd started moving again after thinking she'd found somewhere she could stop. She didn't tell them any of that, and they didn't ask. This was, she knew, partly courtesy and partly the frontier's general understanding that people who showed up from somewhere else usually had reasons they'd already examined enough and didn't need to examine again in front of strangers. But she also knew that not asking wasn't the same as not wondering, and that eventually the space a person's silence occupied started to take on a shape, and people started to fill it with whatever story made sense to them. She'd seen that happen before. It never ended well. What she didn't expect was for it to be Garrick who addressed it, and not in the way she'd braced for. It was a Friday evening in the third week of December, and the others had gone to bed early or were occupied in the bunkhouse, and she was sitting at the table doing the household accounts. She'd taken over the ranch accounts as well by that point, somewhat accidentally, after discovering that they had a box of receipts and invoices that no one had reconciled since September, and Garrick was at the other end of the table doing something with a piece of tack that needed repair. They'd been sitting there in comfortable silence, which was a thing they'd developed over the weeks without either of them having decided to. He said, without looking up, "You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to tell me." She set down her pencil. "I know that." "I mean it in the practical sense," he said, not as a preamble to asking. "I understood what you meant." He worked the leather for a moment. "The thing about this ranch," he said slowly, "is that we've had people come through here and either stay or move on, and I've never once found it useful to know more about where they'd been than they felt like sharing. What I find useful is whether they're honest and whether they can do the work." "And you've concluded that I'm honest," she said, with a slight inflection that was not quite a question. He looked up then. "I've concluded that you work like someone who's trying to prove something to themselves, not to impress anyone else. That's usually a decent indicator." She didn't have a response to that immediately. It was more perceptive than she'd been giving him credit for, which she noted and filed away. "You're more observant than you look," she said. "I look like a man who spent the last 4 hours fixing a water trough," he said. "That's not a high bar." She almost laughed. It surprised her enough that she caught it before it got out. But something must have shown in her face because he looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not quite a smile, but in the vicinity of one. "Thank you," she said, "for the work, for all of it. You earn it." "I know I do," she said. I still wanted to say it. He nodded once, the way he nodded when something had been settled, and went back to the tack. She went back to the accounts. But the silence after that was different from the silence before it. Not in any way she could have pointed to specifically, just the way that a room can hold a different quality of air after something true has been said in it. By Christmas, she had stopped flinching every time hoofbeats came down the road toward the ranch. It wasn't a decision she'd made deliberately. It was just something she noticed was no longer happening. The automatic tightening, the assessment of exits, the mental rehearsal of what she'd say and where she'd go. Those reflexes didn't disappear entirely. They'd been too long in the building for that, but they got quieter, less immediate. The brothers did not make a large production of Christmas. They had a tradition, apparently, of a decent meal and whatever small thing each of them could produce or find as a gesture toward the day. Seb made something involving honey and dried apricots that was meant to be a cake and was more accurately described as an enthusiastic attempt at a cake. Niall produced a bottle of whiskey from somewhere. Callum, unexpectedly, had a decent singing voice and at some point in the evening started singing something she didn't recognize. And Bram and Theo joined in on the second verse with the particular lack of self-consciousness of people who have no audience to perform for. She'd brought something too. She'd found enough materials in the ranch stores to put together small repair kits: needle, thread, a few spare buttons, a length of leather cord, wrapped in cloth and left at each of their places at the table. It was a practical gift, and she'd been slightly uncertain about it, but Callum picked his up and looked at it for a moment and said, "I've been missing a button on my coat since November." And that seemed to settle whether it had been the right thing. Garrick's gift to her was a new pair of gloves, work gloves, good quality leather, the right size. She looked at them for a moment and then at him. "How did you know the size?" she asked. "Your old ones are on the peg by the door," he said. "I looked." It was, she told herself, a practical observation from a practical man. It meant nothing beyond that. But she held the gloves for longer than she needed to. The new year came in cold and harder than the old one had ended, and January settled over the Black Ridge Valley like something that had decided it was permanent. The grass was gone entirely now under the frost. The cattle required constant management, moving between the covered portions of the pasture and the water sources that the brothers kept unfrozen through rotation and effort. The days were short, and the work was long, and the house, which she had by now arranged to function like something that deserved to be called a home, became the center around which the whole operation turned. She'd stopped thinking about leaving. She was aware of this. She noted it with the part of her that was still keeping track, still monitoring, still running the calculations she'd learned to run automatically. It was a change that had happened without her permission, and it worried her in a way she couldn't entirely suppress. Because the only time she'd stopped thinking about leaving before had been when she'd thought she was somewhere safe. And the only time she'd discovered she was wrong about being somewhere safe were the times that had cost her the most. One evening in late January, she was sitting by the window after the others had gone to bed, watching the snow that had been falling since midday and thinking, without meaning to, about the irrigation channels she'd heard the brothers discussing over dinner. The old waterways that were supposed to run beneath the valley floor, cut decades ago by settlers who'd eventually abandoned them when the water didn't come as expected. She'd heard about channels like those before. She'd grown up, in the years before everything had gotten complicated, near a valley in Montana where a similar system had been built and then left to silt over. She knew how they worked. She knew how they could fail and how they could be made to work again. The valley was getting dry. Drier than the brothers seemed to realize, even under all this snow. She sat with that knowledge, turning it over, not sure what to do with it. Outside, the snow kept falling on the frozen earth, and somewhere under all of it, if the stories were right, there were channels cut in stone and soil that hadn't seen water in longer than anyone in Black Ridge could remember. She pulled her coat tighter and kept watching the dark outside the window, and did not stop thinking. The snow that had started in late January didn't stop for 11 days. By the time it ended, the drifts along the north side of the barn were chest high on a tall man, and the road to Black Ridge had disappeared entirely under a white expanse that looked from the ranch house window like the world had simply decided to start over without asking anyone's permission. The brothers worked in shifts to keep the cattle from freezing, rotating through the night in pairs while the others slept in 2-hour intervals, and the house ran on the particular exhausted rhythm of people doing what needed doing without the energy left over to complain about it. Maeve kept the fires going and the food coming and the household from sliding into the kind of disorder that sets in when people are too tired to maintain it. She slept less than she should have. She knew this, and she did it anyway, because the alternative was watching things fall apart, and she had never been built for that. It was during the tail end of the storm, on the 9th night, that Callum's chest finally gave out. He came in from the midnight shift coughing in a way that was different from the roughness she'd been hearing for weeks. Deeper, wetter, the kind of cough that comes from somewhere serious. He sat down on the bench near the door and didn't move, and she looked at him for about 3 seconds before she pulled his coat off him herself and told him to sit closer to the stove. "I'm fine," he said. "You're not," she said. "Move." He moved. She made a steam tent out of a blanket and a pot of boiling water and made him sit under it for 20 minutes while she found the camphor she'd seen in the back of the supply pantry and figured out from memory what her mother had done with it when she was a child and someone in the house was sick. When Garrick came in at 2 in the morning and found his oldest brother wrapped in a blanket over a pot of steam, he looked at Maeve across the room. "How long has he been like this?" he asked. "The cough's been building for weeks," she said. "Tonight it got bad." Garrick looked at Callum. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because there's work," Callum said from under the blanket. "There's always work," Garrick said. His voice was level, but something behind his eyes wasn't. He looked back at Maeve. What does he need? Rest, heat, liquids, and for nobody to put him back on the night rotation until this clears. She paused. At least 4 days, probably 5. Garrick nodded once. He pulled a chair up next to Callum and sat down, and neither of them said anything for a while, and Maeve went back to the stove and didn't try to fill the silence. That was the night she understood something about the Rowan brothers that she hadn't quite seen clearly before. The way Garrick sat there, not hovering, not talking, just present, was not something you did for someone you merely lived with. It was something you did for someone you'd been responsible for a long time. The way you're responsible for a person when you've been the one standing between them and whatever the world was trying to do to them. She thought about that for a while after she went to bed. She didn't arrive at any comfortable conclusions. Callum recovered over the following week, grudgingly and with the particular resentment of a physically strong person who finds themselves temporarily unable to be physically strong. He was a bad patient in the specific way of men who have never allowed themselves to be patients. He tried to get up too early, argued about whether he needed to keep the window closed, and at one point attempted to go out to the barn on the 3rd day before Maeve met him at the door and simply stood in it. "Move," he said. "No," she said. He was about 6 inches taller than her and probably 80 pounds heavier. They both understood that. "Maeve," he said. "Callum," she said. A pause. "I need to check on the gray mare," he said. "She was off her feed 2 days ago. Niall checked on her this morning. She's eating. Now go sit down." He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him deciding whether to argue further and concluding, correctly, that it wasn't going to get him anywhere. He turned and went back to his chair, and she heard him, a moment later, pick up the book she'd left on the side table without comment. That evening, Niall came in and confirmed, unprompted, that the gray mare was eating fine and seemed to be improving, and Callum said nothing, but she caught him looking at her from across the room with an expression that might, from a certain angle, have been something approaching gratitude. By the end of the 2nd week of February, the worst of the storm season seemed to have exhausted itself, and the valley moved into the kind of cold that was stable and manageable rather than aggressive. The brothers returned to full operation. The house returned to its rhythm. And Black Ridge, which had been holding its breath under the snow, began to show signs of life again, which was when the first real trouble started. She heard about the Crane brothers before she met them. It was Seb who mentioned them first, the way Seb mentioned things, in the middle of another topic, as if it were a footnote rather than the point. "Harlan Crane was in town yesterday," he said at breakfast one morning, "asking Percy Burrows about our east pasture boundary." The table shifted, not visibly, but in some quality of attention. "What kind of asking?" Garrick said. "The kind where he already thinks he knows the answer and is testing whether anyone will tell him different," Seb said. Maeve looked up from the account book she'd been reviewing. "Who is Harlan Crane?" "Rancher," Niall said. "Runs about twice the land we do, about 8 miles east. He and his brother Dolph have been trying to expand south since last summer." "Toward your pasture," she said. "Toward our pasture," Garrick confirmed. He said it evenly, the way he said most things, but she'd been living in the same house with him long enough to hear the thing underneath it. "There's a survey question about the east boundary. The original land grant has some ambiguous language. Crane knows it." "Do you have the survey documents?" she asked. "We have some of them," Garrick said. "The original survey marker's gone, washed out, or moved. We've never been able to prove which. When was the grant filed?" He looked at her. "You know something about land grants?" "I know enough," she said. "When was it filed?" 1871. Under my father. Is there a copy at the land office in town? There should be. She closed the account book. Then that's where I'd start. The brothers exchanged a look that went around the table quickly. It wasn't a look of doubt, exactly. It was more the look of people who'd been dealing with a problem for long enough that they'd stopped seeing the obvious angles. I can ride in with you, Seb offered. I don't need an escort, she said. I know. I just like going to town. But she went to the land office on a Thursday, which was one of the 2 days a week it was open for business. The man behind the counter was a dry, precise individual named Aldous Fenn, who had the manner of someone who had been filing papers for a long time and had developed a corresponding relationship with human beings. He found the Rowan land grant after about 10 minutes of searching and spread it on the counter without much ceremony. The document was exactly what Garrick had described. A land grant with boundaries described in language that a person with good intentions could read one way and a person with bad intentions could read another. The east boundary referenced a creek junction that, according to Niles' description of the current landscape, had likely shifted in the decades since the document was written. She read it twice. Then she asked Aldous Fenn if there were any survey maps from the 1870s for the eastern part of the valley. He found 3 of them in a flat drawer under the counter, rolled and dry and smelling of old paper. The third one told her what she needed to know. There was a stone formation, a specific outcropping described in the original survey notes, that would have been used as a secondary reference point when the creek junction was established. If the outcropping still existed, it would establish the original boundary line regardless of where the creek had moved. Do you know where this formation is? She asked Fenn. He looked at the map, traced the coordinates with one finger, and said, That would be on the Rowan property, near as I can figure. Eastern edge. Has anyone from the crane operation requested these maps in the past year? Fenn looked at her steadily. I can't speak to that. Can't or won't. He didn't answer. She thanked him and left. Matt. When she explained it at dinner that evening, the table was quiet in the way it got when something important was being said. If the outcropping is still there, she said, and if it matches the secondary reference in the original survey notes, then the boundary is exactly where your father recorded it. Crane can argue about the creek all he wants. It won't matter. We've never found a secondary reference in the survey notes, Garrick said. You were looking at the grant document, she said, not the survey maps. They're separate files. A silence. Bram said, Huh. The question is whether the formation is still visible, she went on. If it's been buried or cleared or obscured somehow, you've got less to stand on. But if it's there, Niles said, with a certainty that made several heads turn. There's a rock formation on the east edge that we use as a landmark for the cattle rotation. I've seen it 100 times. Didn't know it was in any document. Maeve looked at Garrick. He was looking back at her with an expression she'd seen before, that careful, concentrated attention. You should have a survey done, she said, formally, before Crane does. That costs money, Callum said. It costs less than losing the east pasture. Nobody argued with that. Garrick said, I'll write to the Territorial Survey Office tomorrow. She nodded. She picked up her fork. Around her, the brothers gradually did the same, and conversation moved on to other things, but there was something in the room that hadn't been there at the start of the meal, a solidity maybe, or a direction, the feeling of a problem that had been vague and threatening now becoming specific enough to address. She was aware, in a way she found difficult, of how much she'd come to depend on that feeling, the feeling of problems that could be solved if you looked at them clearly enough. But not every problem could be approached that way. The trouble that came from town in early March arrived not in any form she could document or dispute, but in the form of what people said to each other in the brass kettle and outside the general store and in the particular economy of small-place gossip that traded in speculation and innuendo and the unspoken assumption that a woman living alone among 6 men was a fact that required explanation. She knew what they were saying because Seb told her, and because she could read it in the faces of the 2 women who went silent when she came into the general store one afternoon, and because Hetty Burrows, who was, Maeve had determined, a fundamentally decent person, pulled her aside while her husband wasn't looking and said quietly, I want you to know that not everyone in this town shares those opinions. I know, Maeve said. Thank you. If there's anything I can... I know, Maeve said again, more gently. I appreciate it. She rode back to the ranch that afternoon with the kind of anger she'd learned to keep very quiet. Not at Hetty, who'd meant well. Not even at the specific people who'd been talking. She'd met their type in enough places to understand that they weren't especially original. She was angry at the mechanism of it, the way a woman's presence became, in the calculation of certain minds, always a question of propriety rather than a question of her own living and working and being. She'd been making herself smaller in relation to that mechanism for long enough that she recognized the reflex when it started in her. The automatic thought, maybe I should go. Before this gets worse, before it reflects on them. She recognized it. She sat with it. And she decided, somewhere on that road between town and the ranch, that she was tired of it. When she got back, she put away her horse and went inside and started making dinner. And she didn't say anything about the afternoon until Garrick came in and looked at her face, just looked at it briefly, and said, "Bad day in town?" "Nothing I haven't handled before," she said. He was quiet for a moment, then, "That's not really an answer." "No," she agreed, "it isn't." She told him then. Not with drama, not looking for sympathy, but plainly, the way she told him things when she decided to tell them. What Hetty had said, what the implication was, the general quality of the opinion running through Black Ridge about the woman living on the Rowan Ranch. He listened without interrupting. "I'm not going to leave," she said when she'd finished. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not bringing it up because I'm thinking about leaving. I'm bringing it up because you should know what you're dealing with in terms of what people are saying about your household." "I know what they're saying," he said. "Does it matter to you?" He thought about this, genuinely considered it, which she'd come to understand was his way. "What matters to me," he said, "is whether the people living and working on this ranch are being treated fairly. What the brass kettle thinks about my household arrangements is not something I've ever spent much time on." "Your reputation matters for the land dispute," she said, "for the survey, for the territorial office. People's opinion of you and your family matters in practical ways." "It does," he agreed, "and I'd rather have you here and manage whatever that costs than send you away and pretend the cost isn't still there in different form." He paused. "You do good work. You've kept this family going through a winter that was trying hard to break it. Whatever the town wants to make of that is the town's problem." She stood there with the spoon in her hand and the stove going behind her and the late afternoon light coming through the window over the sink, and something she had kept at a careful distance for 2 months pushed itself slightly closer, and she let it, just slightly, before she set the spoon down and turned back to the stove. "Thank you," she said. "You keep saying that." "You keep earning it, Mom." The Crane brothers came to the ranch on a gray Tuesday in mid-March. There were 2 of them, Harlan, who was the older one, a large man in an expensive coat with the practiced ease of someone who had learned that a certain bearing could do the work of a threat without the legal risk, and Dolph, who was heavier and quieter, and had the look of the kind of man who said little and noticed everything. They arrived at the gate around mid-morning and asked for Garrick by name. Maeve was in the barn when she heard them. She stayed where she was, doing what she'd been doing, but she listened. Garrick came out to the yard. Callum came with him. The conversation she could hear from inside the barn was polite, in the particular way that conversations between men who don't trust each other are polite. Careful word choices, studied pleasantness, the shape of civility wrapped around something that was not civil. Harlan Crane said he'd heard the Rowans were considering a formal survey of the East Pasture. Garrick said that was his business. Harlan said he only mentioned it because there had been some confusion historically about where the boundary ran, and he wouldn't want a survey to produce findings that complicated things unnecessarily. Garrick said he expected a proper survey would uncomplicate things rather than complicate them. A pause. Harlan said that he hoped Garrick understood that the Crane family had been in this valley a long time and had relationships here that ran deep, and that he'd hate for something as dry as a land survey to create friction between neighbors who'd always gotten along. Garrick said he hadn't been aware they'd always gotten along. Another pause. Longer. Dolph said, for the first time, "Nice place you've got." It was the way he said it, looking at the ranch, at the repaired fences and the smoke from the chimney and the general air of a property that had been set back in order, that made the hair on the back of her neck move. She stepped out of the barn door. All 4 of them looked at her. She met Harlan Crane's gaze, then Dolph's, then looked back at the barn, moving with the deliberate unhurriedness of someone who had every right to be exactly where she was. "Need anything?" she asked Garrick. "No," he said. She nodded and went back inside. She didn't hear the rest of the conversation, but it ended shortly after, and she heard the sound of horses leaving. When Garrick came into the barn 5 minutes later, she was back to what she'd been doing, cleaning a bridle. He stood in the doorway for a moment. "That was deliberate," he said. "Was it helpful?" He considered. "They don't know who you are. They don't know how much you know about the land situation. That uncertainty is worth something." "That was the thought," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer. "You've been in these kinds of situations before," he said. It was not quite a question. "I've been in a lot of kinds of situations," she said. He didn't ask what kind. She found herself, not for the first time, grateful for that, and at the same time, for the first time in a long time, vaguely wishing that he had. What she noticed about the ranch in March, as the cold began its slow, reluctant retreat, was how much had changed since she'd arrived. The house was not the same house. It was clean in a different way. Not just cleaned, but arranged, tended, made to feel as if someone was paying attention to it. The kitchen was a place where things worked. The accounts were in order. The small repairs she'd made over the months had accumulated into something that added up to a property that functioned the way a property was meant to. But it was the brothers who had changed most. Or more precisely, it was something between them that had changed. The exhaustion that had sat in the house like a resident when she'd first arrived, the particular weight of men who had been managing alone for too long, had lifted by degrees. They ate better. They slept with less disruption. Callum's chest had cleared. Theo had started doing the thing where he finished his sentences, which she'd come to understand meant he was doing all right. Seb had told her one evening, when it was just the two of them finishing up in the kitchen, "You know, this place feels different." "How so?" she asked. "Like someone's looking after it," he said. He was washing dishes, not looking at her. "We were looking after the ranch, you know, the animals, the land, all of that. But nobody was looking after the house. Nobody was looking after us." He paused. "Orel did some of that, but not like this." She didn't say anything. "Garrick would want me to say this less plainly than I'm saying it," Seb said. "Then why aren't you?" He shrugged. "Because sometimes saying a thing plainly is the only way it lands." She looked at his profile for a moment, young, honest, a little reckless in the way that came from not having been hurt by the world badly enough yet. "Don't build too much on this," she said, "on me being here." "Why not?" "Because I've been in places before that I thought I could stay and I was wrong." He turned to look at her then. "What made you wrong?" She was quiet. "Nothing here is going to run you off," he said. "Not the town, not the cranes, not—" "You don't know that," she said, "and neither do I." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think you know more than you're giving yourself credit for." She didn't answer him, but she stood there in that kitchen that she had made into a kitchen, in that house that she had made into something that deserved the name, and she felt the weight of his words sit against something in her chest that she had been carefully keeping at a distance. She wasn't sure anymore how much longer she was going to be able to do that. Outside the window, the frost was thinning on the fields. The valley was still hard and brown and cold, but underneath all of that, somewhere in the earth, there was the slow movement of things beginning again. She could feel it, the way the light had shifted in the last 2 weeks, the way the mornings had a different quality to them, the way winter was starting to run out of the authority it had held over everything since October. She thought about the irrigation channels. She'd been thinking about them, on and off, since January. The valley was too dry. She'd noticed it in ways the brothers hadn't, or at least hadn't articulated. The depth of the soil cracking under the frost, the way the creek ran lower than it should, the dryness of the grass that came back in the early thaw. A valley this size, with this much livestock and cropland, needed water that wasn't coming reliably from the sky alone. And if there were channels under there, cut by hands that had believed in this place enough to try to build something permanent, if those channels were still intact, if they could be cleared and restored, she stopped herself. It was a significant undertaking. It would require all of them, and more. It would require convincing people who had already decided something was impossible. She turned away from the window. The valley was not her responsibility. The ranch was where her work ended. She had enough to manage without taking on the problems of a territory that hadn't shown any particular interest in her welfare. She turned away from the window, and she went to bed. But she lay awake longer than she'd meant to, thinking about water moving through channels cut in the earth, and a valley full of people who didn't know yet that the worst of what was coming hadn't arrived. Spring came to the Black Ridge Valley the way it always did in that part of the territory. Not all at once, but in arguments. A warm week followed by a hard freeze. Mud that thawed by noon and refroze by midnight. The cattle restless because their instincts told them to move, but the ground couldn't make up its mind whether to support that. The brothers worked through it with the patience of men who had learned that the season would arrive when it arrived and not before. And the house held its rhythm, and Maeve held hers. But something was wrong with the water. She'd been watching it since February, the way she watched most things. Quietly, without announcing it, accumulating observations until she had enough to say something with. The creek that ran along the western edge of the property had been low all winter, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the way it was behaving in the thaw. A normal spring melt brought the creek up. This year, it came up for 3 days and then dropped back to a level that wasn't right for the season. The snowpack in the hills above the valley had been decent. The water should have been there. She mentioned it to Niall first because Niall was the one who knew the land's practical details best. "I've noticed," he said. They were out near the eastern pasture, checking the fence line. The survey had been scheduled for the following month, and Garrick wanted everything documented carefully before it happened. "Last 2 years, the creek's been lower than it used to be. People say it's a dry cycle." "Is it?" she said. He looked at the ground for a moment. "My father used to say this valley had good water under it, that the first settlers found springs that ran year-round. Then something changed, and people stopped finding them." He shrugged. "I always thought it was just talk." "What kind of change?" He never said exactly. Something about the land being worked wrong, channels being blocked. He looked up. Why? She'd been carrying the question of the irrigation channel since January. She'd looked at it from enough angles now to know it wasn't a passing thought. "I want to see the eastern edge of the valley," she said. "The low ground near the old Tanner claim." Niall looked at her with the expression he got when he was deciding how seriously to take something. He was the most careful of the brothers in that way. Not skeptical exactly, but slow to commit until he'd run through the practical implications. "That's half a day's ride," he said. "I know." "What are you looking for?" "I want to see if there's still evidence of the old channels, the ones people say were dug in the 60s. He was quiet for a moment. "Most folks think those are just a story." "Most folks thought the Northwest Pass was impassable after first frost," she said. He looked at her. Then he almost smiled, which for Niall was the equivalent of laughing out loud. "I'll saddle up," he said. That's what they found at the eastern edge of the valley was not dramatic, not at first. It looked like rough ground, the kind of terrain that accumulated in low-lying areas, shaped by years of freezing and thawing and the movement of seasonal water. But Maeve had grown up near a valley where the same kind of channels had been built, and she knew what to look for in the land's surface when you stopped looking at it as scenery and started looking at it as engineering. The depressions were there, long, shallow troughs running in lines that were too regular to be natural. Not perfectly straight because the ground didn't permit that, but following the grade in a way that water would have followed if it had been directed to. She could see 3 of them from where she stood, and where the frost had pulled back enough to expose the soil, the earth in those depressions was a different color from the ground around them, darker, richer, the kind of soil that had been moved by human hands and then left to settle back over decades. "There," she said. Niall looked at where she was pointing. She watched his face as he processed it, the slow shift from skepticism to something more uncertain. "Those could just be natural formations," he said. "They could," she agreed. "Ride the line of them with me." They rode it for nearly 2 miles, following the depressions as they traced their way across the low valley floor. At the end of 2 miles, the line bent north, and where it bent, there was a stone structure. Not much left of it, 3 courses of dry-laid rock above the frost line and more below, but unmistakably built by someone with a purpose. Niall got off his horse and crouched next to it. He didn't say anything for a long moment. "This is real," he said finally. "Yes, these channels, if they were cleared, if they were functional." "The water's there," she said. "It's not gone. It's blocked. Silted over, probably, or collapsed in sections. But the grade is still right, and the source is still there, up in that northeastern draw. She pointed to the hills. That's where the springs are. That's where this was meant to start. Niall stood up slowly. He looked out across the valley, at the brown march grass, at the distant scatter of homesteads, at the town just barely visible as a smudge at the valley's northern end. People have been losing stock to the dry summers for 3 years, he said quietly. I know. The Tanner family abandoned their claim last August. I know that too. He looked at her. Maeve, this is... He stopped, started again. If this worked, if it actually worked, we don't know if it can be made to work, she said. I don't want to promise something before we understand what we're dealing with. We need to know how much of the system is intact and how much has collapsed completely. We'd need to follow it all the way back to the source and map what's there. That's days of work, maybe more. Yes. He was quiet, calculating the way he did. I'll talk to Garrick, she said. The conversation with Garrick was not simple, which she'd expected. She laid it out for him that evening after the others had gone to bed. Niall sitting at the table as confirmation, the rough sketch she'd drawn of the channel line in front of them. Garrick listened the way he always listened, without interrupting, with the particular quality of attention that she'd come to understand meant he was weighing everything and not just the surface of it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. How certain are you, he asked, about the channels existing? Certain. About whether they can be made functional. I don't know yet. That's what we'd need to find out. And if it can be done, it helps the whole valley, not just us. Yes. He looked at the sketch. The Tanner claim is abandoned. Who owns that land now? Still in probate, as far as I know, she said. Nobody's claimed it. The channel line crosses it? For about 1/3 of a mile. He turned the sketch. And the draw at the north end. That's on Haskell's land. It is. He'd need to be part of it. Fletcher Haskell, Garrick said, with a tone that conveyed something without spelling it out. What's wrong with Haskell? She asked. Niall and Garrick exchanged the look that passed between them sometimes. The look of a shared history she hadn't been part of. Haskell's not wrong, Niall said carefully. He'd need convincing, Garrick said. He doesn't do anything because it's the right thing. He does things because they benefit him. It would benefit him, Maeve said. The source draw is on his land. If the system works, he gets reliable water on the north end. He's not stupid. No, Garrick said. He's not. He looked at the sketch for another moment. She could see him doing the calculation, the time it would take, the labor, the uncertainty of the outcome, the risk of committing weeks of work to something that might ultimately fail. She could also see, under that, something else. The specific quality of a man who had been managing survival for long enough that the idea of something that might do more than just survive hadn't entirely stopped being appealing. We'd have to do the survey first, he said, before we take on anything of this scale. Get the east pasture boundary settled. Agreed, she said. And we'd need to go out there properly. Map the whole system before we talk to anyone else about it. I'm not walking into Fletcher Haskell's yard with half an idea. That's what I'd recommend, she said. He looked at her. Who else knows the channels exist the way you know them? The mechanics of how they'd work? I grew up near a system like this, she said. In Montana. I saw one restored when I was young. I know the general principle. I don't know the specifics of this valley's terrain well enough yet to say exactly what it would take. But you could figure it out. With the right information, yes. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved against the house and settled. All right, he said. We go out there, all of us. We map what we can find and we see what we're dealing with. He paused. And Maeve, this was good thinking. It was such a simple thing to say that she almost let it go past her. Instead, she met his eyes for a moment and said, let's see if it's good thinking after we know what's down there. They went out in the second week of April, all 7 of them, with tools and provisions for 3 days. The territorial survey for the east pasture had happened and gone well. The stone formation had been exactly where Niall said it was, matching the secondary survey reference precisely, and the surveyor's report had been filed with the land office in a way that would make any future claim by the Crane brothers considerably more difficult to pursue. That piece of ground had been resolved. The other piece, the larger, more complicated one, was what lay ahead of them. The first day was hard in the way that serious outdoor work in early spring is always hard. The ground was unpredictable, firm in places, soft in others, liable to collapse under a person's weight in ways that weren't apparent from the surface. They followed the channel lines Maeve had mapped with Niall, and what they found confirmed what she'd suspected. The system was more intact than it had any right to be after 40-odd years of neglect, but intact didn't mean functional. There were 3 major collapse points in the first 2 miles, places where the channel walls had caved in and silted over completely, and clearing those sections would require significant digging. The grade was still right. The stonework at the junction points, where the original builders had done the most careful construction, was largely sound. Bram crawled down into one of the collapsed sections on the second morning, moving through the dark with a lantern and coming out with his face and arms covered in black soil, and sat on the edge of the excavation for a while before speaking. "It's tight," he said. 2 of those collapses are at bends where the soil's compacted hard. It'd take at least 3 days to clear them out properly. Maybe 4. "Can it be done?" Maeve asked. "It can be done," Bram said. "It'll be miserable, but it can be done." Theo, who had been examining the stone junction nearby, said, "The stonework here is... whoever built this knew what they were doing. This section is solid. It's the earthen sections that have given way." "That's typical," Maeve said. "You reinforce the earthen sections, and the stone takes care of itself." Callum had been quiet most of the morning, which wasn't unusual, but there was a quality to his quiet on that second day that she noticed. He'd been walking the channel line slowly, stopping at intervals, looking at the land rather than just the channel itself. She came to stand near him at one point, and he said without looking at her, "My father used to say the valley would dry out. That water was borrowed, and we were spending it." He paused. "We thought he was being pessimistic." "Maybe he was just paying attention," she said. Callum looked at her. His expression was the difficult one to read, the one that had taken her months to understand. Not closed, just deep. "How do you do that?" he asked. "Do what?" "See things that are already there, that everyone else has been walking past." She thought about this. "I learned to look because not looking cost me," she said. "That's all. It's not a skill. It's just what happens when the price is high enough." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," he said, "for whatever the price was." She hadn't expected that, and it landed somewhere unguarded. She looked out at the valley spread below them, the gray-brown spring ground, the distant glint of the low creek, the far smudge of Black Ridge. "Thank you," she said, which she knew, by now, was the thing she said when she didn't have words that were adequate. The source draw was at the northeastern end of the channel system, on Fletcher Haskell's land, and reaching it required crossing 2 ridges and a section of rocky terrain that had everyone on foot for the last mile. They arrived there on the afternoon of the second day, and what they found was not what any of them had expected. The draw was a narrow cut in the hillside, maybe 40 feet across at its widest, with steep walls of layered stone and soil. At its head, where the channel system had been designed to begin, there was a spring, not a trickle, a genuine spring, pushing water from between 2 slabs of stone with enough pressure to make a sound. The water ran 6 feet and then disappeared back into the earth, absorbed by the silted channel system that had been waiting, under decades of dirt and debris, to carry it somewhere. They stood and looked at it. Nobody said anything for a while. Seb crouched next to the water's edge and put his hand into the flow. "It's cold," he said. "This is real snowmelt. This is coming from deep." "It's been coming from deep all along," Niall said. He was looking at the spring with something that Maeve could only describe as a complicated grief. The expression of a man who had been living next to something he needed without knowing it was there. Garrick stood slightly apart from the others. She'd noticed that about him. The way he processed things at a small remove, not detached but needing the space to think clearly. She came to stand near him. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. "It's real," she said. "All of it." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "We need to talk to Haskell." "I know. He's not going to make this easy." "No," she said, "but he's going to have a dry summer again if he doesn't, and the summer after that, and the one after that." Garrick looked at the spring for another moment, at the water pushing out of the hillside with quiet, relentless force. "Who do you think built this?" he said. The original system. People who were trying to stay, she said, who were trying to build something that would last beyond themselves. He turned and looked at her then. Really looked at her. In the way that happened only occasionally. The way that made her careful in the vicinity of things she hadn't decided to say yet. That's why it matters to you, he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Doesn't it matter to you? Yes, he said. But I grew up here. I have roots here I didn't choose. You chose to care about this valley. He paused. That's different. She didn't have a response to that. She turned and looked back at the spring, at the water that had been running in secret all this time. We should camp here tonight, she said, before the ride back. Agreed, he said, and turned to tell the brothers. Fletcher Haskell received them 3 days later. He was a compact, self-contained man in his mid-50s with the leathery look of someone who had spent 30 years outdoors and the watchful eyes of someone who had learned that other people's proposals were generally other people's advantages. He met them in the yard of his homestead, a tidy, well-maintained property on the valley's northern edge, and he did not invite them inside, which Maeve had expected. Garrick laid it out plainly. The channel system, the spring on Haskell's land, the collapses that could be cleared, the water that could be restored to the whole valley. Haskell listened with the expression of a man listening for the catch. What do you want from me? He said when Garrick finished. Access to the draw, Garrick said, and cooperation in clearing the upper section of the channel that runs through your land. That's labor, Haskell said. It is. And what do I get? You get water, Garrick said. Reliable water, on the north end, for the first time in years. You get it before anyone else because you're at the top of the system. Haskell looked at Maeve. He'd been looking at her periodically since they'd arrived, not rudely, but assessingly. You're the woman from the Rowan Ranch, he said. I am, she said. You figure this out? Niall and I found the channels. The system was built by someone else a long time ago. But you understood what it was. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. She could see him running the calculations, the labor involved, the uncertainty of the outcome, the benefit if it worked. He was the kind of man who didn't act from generosity and didn't pretend otherwise. And she found that, in a strange way, easier to work with than people who acted from pretended generosity and meant something else. If it doesn't work, he said, I've put labor into a hole in the ground. That's right, she said. And if it does work, every rancher in the valley benefits, not just me. That's also right, she said. You'd benefit most because you're at the source. But yes, the whole valley gets water. He looked at her. You're not trying to convince me this is only good for me. I don't think you'd believe it if I tried, she said. And I think you can make your own calculation about whether a valley that has water is better for you to live in than a valley that doesn't. A silence. Haskell looked at Garrick. Your family's been here longer than most, he said. You're not the type to start something you don't finish. No, Garrick said. And the crane business. The survey came out your way. It did. Another silence. Longer. A cold wind came down from the hills behind the homestead. All right, Haskell said. I'll give you access to the draw, and I'll put 2 men on the upper channel clearing, but I want it understood. He looked at Maeve, that if this fails, we don't talk about it again. Understood, she said. He nodded once, the way men in that territory nodded when something was settled, and turned and went back inside. Seb, under his breath, said, That was terrifying and somehow it worked. Seb, Garrick said, I mean it as a compliment. Maeve turned and started walking back to the horses, and she did not let herself think yet about what came next. The weeks of labor, the uncertainty, the chance that the collapses were worse than they looked, and the whole effort would come to nothing. She held the fact of Haskell's agreement and let it be enough for the moment. They began the clearing in the 3rd week of April. It was 14 people in total, the 6 brothers, Haskell's 2 men, and a handful of other valley ranchers that Niall and Garrick had quietly spoken to in the days between Haskell's agreement and the start of the work. Not everyone they approached said yes. 2 families declined without explanation. One man, a rancher named Purdy, who had been particularly vocal in town about his opinions of the woman living on the Rowan Ranch, said yes, but showed up on the first day and spent most of it watching rather than working, as if he hadn't quite decided yet. Maeve worked alongside the brothers. She had mapped the system carefully enough that she understood where to direct the labor, which collapses to clear first based on the grade, which sections of the channel wall needed reinforcing before the water could be let through, where the original stonework needed supplementing versus where it could be trusted. She wasn't the strongest person there by a significant margin, but she was the one who understood the system as a whole, and she moved between the work sites with the plans in her head and the ability to make decisions quickly when the ground presented something unexpected. The second collapse point, on the morning of the third day, presented something very unexpected. Bram and Callum were working the main channel section 15 feet below the surface when the east wall gave way. It wasn't a catastrophic collapse, nobody was hurt, but it was large enough and fast enough that for a few seconds it was unclear whether Bram had gotten clear of it. The soil came down in a rush of black earth, and the channel filled waist-high, and Maeve, who had been up on the ridge above, was down the slope and at the edge of the excavation before she'd consciously decided to move. Bram came up out of the soil, coughing and swearing, covered from the waist down and bleeding from a cut on his forearm where something had caught him on the way out. Callum was already pulling him the rest of the way clear, and Garrick was there a moment later, and everyone was talking at once, and Bram held up a hand. "I'm fine," he said. "It's a scratch." "Your arm is bleeding through your sleeve," Maeve said. "I've had worse." "That's not the standard I'm working to," she said. She pulled his sleeve back and looked at the cut. Deep enough to need attention, but not deep enough to be serious. She wrapped it with the cloth she carried in her coat pocket, firmly enough to stop the bleeding, and told him to stay out of the excavation for the rest of the day. He started to argue. "Bram?" she said. He stopped. Something in the way she said his name, not loud, not harsh, just with the particular weight of someone who was not going to move on this, settled it. He sat on the bank above the collapsed section and watched while the others worked to clear it. The collapse, once they'd excavated it properly, turned out to have exposed something that hadn't been visible before. A secondary channel branching off to the south, older than the main system, smaller but still structurally intact. It would reach a section of valley that the main channel hadn't been designed to serve. Maeve crouched at the junction and looked at it. "The original builders added this later," she said, more to herself than to anyone else. "They extended it. It was a living system. They kept improving it." Niall crouched next to her. "Does this complicate things?" "No," she said. "It makes it better." She looked at the branch channel. "If we clear this too, the Purdy land gets water." A pause. "Purdy, who spent this morning standing around watching us work," Niall said. "Yes." "And you want to clear it anyway." She looked at the channel. The stone at the junction was careful work. Someone had taken time with it, thought about it, understood that the water would need to serve more than just the people who were there at the beginning. "I want to clear it anyway," she said. Neil didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "All right." Above them, the spring sky held itself open and pale, and the work went on, and the earth began slowly and with considerable resistance to give back what had been buried in it. They cleared the last collapse point on a Friday morning in early May, and nobody celebrated, because there was still the question of whether it would work. The channel system was open now, or as open as 14 people working in 3-week shifts could make it. The major collapses had been excavated and reinforced. The stone junctions had been cleared of debris and checked against Maeve's maps. The secondary branch to the south had been cleared by Niall and Theo in the final 4 days, working in a section so tight that only one person could fit at a time. The upper draw on Haskell's land had been opened at its source the previous week, and water had moved, not much, a trickle, barely enough to follow with your eye, into the top section of the main channel before disappearing into the silted lower portions that weren't cleared yet. Now those lower portions were cleared. Now there was nothing left but to open the source fully and find out. They gathered at the draw on a Friday morning, the 14 of them who had done the work, plus a handful of others who had heard enough to come and watch, without committing to anything. Fletcher Haskell was there, standing slightly apart in the way he always stood, watching with the calibrated attention of a man whose investment in the outcome was real, but who had not yet decided what expression to wear for it. Purdy was there too, which surprised Maeve, though she kept that to herself. Garrick looked at her. "Your call," he said. She looked at the stone dam they'd built at the head of the draw. A simple structure, nothing elegant, just enough to hold back the flow until they were ready. The water was already pressing at it. She could see it in the way the surface moved, the quiet urgency of something that had been waiting for a long time. "Open it halfway first," she said. "Let it find the channel. We watch the first junction point before we open it fully." Niall and Callum moved the first stones. The water came through slowly at first, a dark, spreading line moving along the channel floor, feeling its way into the space they'd carved for it. It reached the first junction and split as it was supposed to, the main flow continuing south and a smaller arm turning east toward Haskell's pastureland. People moved along the bank, following it, not talking much. It reached the first major repair section, the reinforced collapse that had taken 3 days to clear, and slowed. And for a moment, Maeve's stomach tightened because slow could mean a blockage they hadn't found, could mean the whole calculation had been wrong somewhere. Then the water found its grade and moved again, and someone on the far bank said something she couldn't hear. And Seb, who was ahead of the group, turned back with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Not his usual restless humor, but something quieter and more real. "It's moving," he said. "It's actually moving." They opened the dam fully in the afternoon. What came through the channel then was not a trickle. It was the real weight of that snow-melt-fed spring, finding a path it hadn't had in 40 years, moving with the particular authority of water that has been told where to go and is going there. It reached the valley floor in less than 2 hours and spread into the low eastern pastures that had been dry and cracked for 3 summers running. Maeve stood at the main junction point and watched it happen and felt something she didn't have a clean name for. Not triumph, exactly. It was quieter than that, more like the feeling of a thing that was always supposed to be there finally being where it belonged. Haskell appeared beside her. "It works," he said. "It works," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him deciding whether to say something further, the slight friction of a man who didn't naturally move toward acknowledgement. "You were right about the calculation," he said. "The valley with water is better for everyone in it." "It is," she said. Another pause. "I didn't make it easy," he said. "Coming to me. No." "You didn't argue about that." "You came around," she said. "That was enough." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read, and then he nodded once and moved away down the bank. It was, from Fletcher Haskell, a considerable thing. The news reached Black Ridge by sundown. Small places have their own telegraph. Not wire and signal, but the movement of people and horses and the particular speed at which information travels when the thing it concerns affects everyone equally. By the time the Rowan group rode back to town to file the updated water rights documentation that Maeve had drafted 3 weeks earlier in anticipation of exactly this outcome, there were people already standing outside the Brass Kettle and the general store talking about what they'd heard. Some of those people, she noticed, were the same ones who had gone quiet when she walked into the general store in March. She noticed this and kept her face neutral. Aldous Fenn at the land office received the documentation with the same dry precision he brought to everything, reviewed it, asked 3 clarifying questions that she answered without difficulty, and filed it. The water rights attached to the channel system were now recorded under a cooperative designation that included the Rowan Ranch, the Haskell property, and the 6 other Valley families who had participated in the restoration work. Purdy's name was on the document. He hadn't asked to be included. She had included him anyway because the secondary channel served his land whether he'd earned it or not, and because having his name on the paper gave him a reason to care whether the system was maintained. Garrick had looked at the document when she'd drafted it and said, "You put Purdy in." "I did." "He stood on the bank for 3 days." "I know." "Why?" She'd thought about how to answer that. "Because the channel runs through his land and he'll have to live next to it for the rest of his life," she said. "And because people who feel like they're outside something tend to want to see it fail. People who feel like they're part of it, even partially. They behave differently." Garrick had been quiet for a moment. "That's either very wise or very optimistic." "It might be both," she said. "I haven't decided yet." Standing in the land office now, watching Fenn file the final papers, she thought about that. Whether it had been wise or optimistic, or some combination of the two things that she couldn't separate cleanly. Purdy had shown up on the last 2 days of clearing. He hadn't said much, but he'd worked. To what? The reaction from the town was not immediate, and it was not simple. She'd known it wouldn't be. People didn't reverse a winter's worth of gossip and judgment because the spring had brought water. What actually happened was more complicated and less satisfying. The slow, awkward process of people who had said things they now needed to account for trying to find a way to do that without fully admitting what they'd said. Hetty Burroughs was the first person to say anything direct. She came to the ranch on a Saturday in mid-May, arriving in the yard with a covered dish and an expression that had the particular quality of someone who had decided to do something and was going to see it through, regardless of how uncomfortable it got. Maeve came out onto the porch. "I made a ham," Hetty said. "I wanted to bring it personally." "That's kind," Maeve said. "Come in." They sat at the kitchen table. The brothers were out in the pastures, which Maeve suspected Hetty had timed deliberately, and they drank coffee, and Hetty said things she'd clearly rehearsed, and Maeve let her say them. About how the town had been wrong, about the gossip, about her own failure to do more than pull Maeve aside quietly in March and offer the world's smallest reassurance. "I knew what was being said," Hetty said. "I should have said something publicly. Instead, I whispered at you in my own store like that was going to make a difference." "It did make a difference," Maeve said. "I knew you meant it. That's not the same as it being enough." Maeve looked at her. Hetty Burroughs was a decent woman who had been too cautious in the face of her neighbors' opinions, which was a human failing Maeve understood better than most. "It rarely is," Maeve said. "Enough, I mean. The things we do when it's uncomfortable to do them are almost never quite enough. But they're not nothing either." Hetty was quiet for a moment. "You're being very gracious about this." "I'm being honest," Maeve said. "Gracious would be telling you it doesn't matter. It did matter, but it's also done." Hetty looked at her hands around the coffee cup. "Will you stay in Black Ridge?" The question landed in the middle of the kitchen table and sat there. Maeve hadn't been asked that directly before. She'd been circling it in her own head for weeks. Since the clearing work began, really, maybe since before that. Since January and the window and the snow. "I don't know yet," she said. Hetty nodded slowly. "I hope you do," she said. The harder conversation came from a direction she hadn't anticipated. Purdy came to the ranch on a Wednesday afternoon. He came alone, which she noted. He asked for her specifically. Seb told him she was out checking the East Pasture water inlet, and he rode out there rather than wait. He was a man of about 50, lean and weathered, with the slightly formal bearing of someone who had once thought well of himself and had been quietly revising that opinion. He found her at the channel inlet, checking the flow against the measurements she'd been recording since the water came through. "Miss Maeve," he said. He pulled up his horse and got down without being asked, which she took as a sign that this wasn't a casual visit. "Mr. Purdy," she said. He held his hat in his hands for a moment. She waited. "I wasn't decent to you," he said. "In how I talked about you in town. I said things that weren't fair and weren't based in anything real." He paused. "And then you put my name on that water document. My land's been dry 3 years and now it's not, because of something you built, and you put my name on it anyway." He stopped, started again. "I don't know what to do with that." She looked at him for a moment. He wasn't comfortable. He wasn't supposed to be comfortable. He'd done something unkind, and he was living in the consequence of it, which was precisely the discomfort of having to be a better person than you'd been. "You showed up the last 2 days," she said. "It's not nothing," she said. "You could have stayed home." "It wasn't enough for what I said." "No," she agreed. "It probably wasn't." She kept her voice even, not cruel, just honest. But it was the right direction. He was quiet for a moment. "What you put that in your document anyway? The channel runs through your land," she said. "You were going to benefit from it whether you'd said anything or not. I figured you might as well have the responsibility that goes with the benefit." She paused. "People who have responsibility for something tend to take care of it." He looked at her. Something shifted in his face, not quite shame anymore, but something adjacent to it, the beginning of a different kind of reckoning. "I was wrong about you," he said. "Yes," she said, without embellishment. He nodded. He put his hat back on. He got back on his horse. "I'll maintain my section of the channel," he said. "My word on it." "I know," she said. "That's why your name is on the document." He rode back toward town, and she watched him go. And she didn't feel entirely good about the conversation. And she didn't feel entirely bad about it either. It had been real. That was what it had been. The Crane brothers came to the land office in the third week of May. Maeve wasn't there when it happened, but Aldous Fenn told her about it afterward with the careful neutrality of a man who processed information without comment, but also didn't fail to make sure the relevant parties were informed. Harlan and Dolph Crane had arrived on a Monday morning and requested to review the Rowan survey filing and the water rights documentation. Fenn had provided copies, as was their legal right. They had spent about 40 minutes reviewing them. They had left without filing anything. She told Garrick that evening. "What does it mean?" she asked. "In your judgment. You know them better than I do." He was quiet for a moment. "It means they're looking for an angle that isn't there," he said. The survey closed the East Pasture question. The water rights are filed and clean. They spent 40 years in this valley, assuming the land would sort itself in their favor. And now 2 things have sorted in a different direction in the same month. He paused. "It means they're not done, but they don't have a move right now." "We should stay visible," she said. "In town, in the community. The more integrated the ranch is with the valley's interests, the harder it is for them to isolate us." "You've been thinking about this," he said. "I think about most things," she said. He looked at her. He had that quality again. The careful attention she'd stopped being surprised by and hadn't stopped noticing. "When I met you," he said, "you were trying to disappear." She met his eyes. "I know. You're not anymore." She thought about that, whether it was true. What had changed? She knew the general shape of the answer, but the specific weight of it, the part that had to do with this ranch and these people and this man who watched things and didn't look away, that part was harder to hold plainly. "No," she said. "I'm not." He didn't say anything further, and she was grateful for that, for the way he let things be what they were without pushing them into shape before they were ready. The community meeting was called by a man named Aldrich Voss, who served as the valley's informal civic head. Not an elected position, just the kind of authority that accumulates in a small place when someone is consistently present and consistently reasonable. He sent word to the major landholders in the first week of June, requesting a gathering at the schoolhouse in Black Ridge to discuss the valley's water situation and the maintenance of the restored channel system. Maeve almost didn't go, not because she was afraid to, but because there was a part of her that had gotten what she needed from this. The water moving, the channel functioning, the documentation filed, and felt the pull of stepping back. She'd always operated best at a slight remove, and the idea of standing in a room full of people who had thought badly of her and now wanted to renegotiate what she was to them felt exhausting in a way she couldn't entirely justify. Seb found her in the kitchen the morning of the meeting, sitting with the account books and not looking at them. "You're going," he said. "I haven't decided." "Yes, you have," he said. "You decided when you put Purdy's name on the water document and when you drafted the maintenance schedule, and when you spent 3 weeks mapping channels in frozen ground." He sat down across from her. "You can't do all of that and then not show up for the meeting." "I can do whatever I want," she said. "I'm an employee of this ranch." "You're the reason this ranch matters to the rest of the valley," Seb said, "and you know it, and everyone in that schoolhouse tonight is going to know it too." He paused. "That's the part you're actually afraid of." She looked at him. He was 23 and occasionally too perceptive for his own good. "I'm not afraid," she said. "Uncomfortable, then," he said. "Being seen." She didn't answer that. "Maeve," he said, with a straightforwardness that was just Seb being Seb. "You've spent a long time making yourself hard to see, staying in the edges, being useful without being noticed." He shrugged. "I think that was how you survived, but this is different. You built something real here. You can be seen for what you actually are." She sat with that for a moment. "What if what I actually am isn't what people want to see?" she said. "Then that's their problem," Seb said simply. She looked at him for another moment. He held her gaze with the easy steadiness of someone who had thought about what he was going to say and meant it. "Fine," she said. "I'm going." "I know," he said. "You already decided." The schoolhouse held 40 people that evening, which was more than Maeve had expected and apparently more than Aldrich Voss had expected too, judging by the extra chairs being brought in when the brothers arrived. She sat with Garrick and the others toward the middle of the room, which was deliberate on Garrick's part. She'd watched him choose their seats, not at the front, not at the back, just present and visible without being performative about it. Voss opened the meeting and laid out the practical situation. The channel system was operating. The valley's eastern pastures had water for the first time in 3 years. The documentation was filed. The question before the group was how the maintenance of the system would be organized going forward. It was a practical meeting. That was what it was supposed to be. But practical meetings in small communities are rarely only practical. The third person to speak was a woman named Clara Dawes, whose family ran a homestead in the valley's southern section. She stood up and said, with the directness of someone who had decided beforehand to say a thing, "I want to name who did this. Before we talk about maintenance schedules and water allocations, I think we should say clearly who did the work and how it started." The room went quiet. "The Rowan family has been in this valley 20 years, Clara said. They've been decent neighbors and they've minded their own business, and this winter they took in someone who had the knowledge and the will to find something we'd been walking past for 40 years. She paused. "I was one of the people who said things about Maeve that I'm not proud of. I don't think I was the only one." She looked around the room without pointing. "We should say thank you before we move on to logistics." Another silence. Then Fletcher Haskell, who had received them at his gate and not invited them inside, said, "She's right." The room turned slightly at the weight of that. "I wasn't generous when they came to me," he said. "I made it harder than it needed to be, and the water came through anyway." He looked at Garrick. "Your family didn't ask for credit. They just did it. I think we can do at least that much." Garrick, who had been listening with his hands on his knees, said, "We were trying to solve a problem for our own ranch. The rest of it followed from that." He paused. "Maeve saw what none of us had seen. That's the truth of it." Maeve, sitting beside him, felt the room orient toward her. All 40 people in that schoolhouse, in a moment that lasted longer than any moment had a right to. She did not want to stand up. She also understood that Seb had been right. There was a point at which declining visibility became its own kind of dishonesty. She stood up. "The channels were built by people who came before all of us," she said. Her voice was steady, which surprised her slightly. "They built something that was supposed to outlast them. It almost didn't, but it did. What we did was find it and clear it." She looked around the room, at the faces she recognized and the ones she didn't, at Purdy in the third row, who was looking at his hands, at Hetty Burrows, who was not. "The maintenance is the longer work. What gets built in a season needs tending for years. I'd like to be part of that tending, if the valley will have me." She sat down. The silence lasted about 3 seconds. Then Voss said, practically, "Let's talk about the maintenance schedule." And the meeting moved forward, and she felt Garrick's shoulder against hers in the narrow space between chairs, and she did not move away from it. Afterward, when the others had dispersed into the evening, and the brothers had drifted into conversation with various people on the schoolhouse steps, Garrick found her standing at the edge of the road, looking at the valley in the late light. He stood beside her without speaking for a while. "You didn't want to do that," he said. "Stand up in there? Any of it, be known." She looked at the valley, the long, pale light on the spring grass, the distant glint of the creek that was running better than it had in years. "I spent a long time," she said, "making sure the only thing people knew about me was what I chose to show them." She paused. "It kept me safe. It also kept me small, in a way that I didn't notice for a while because I was busy surviving." "And now?" he said. She thought about what Seb had said that morning, about what she'd built, about what it felt like to have your name on something because you'd made it rather than because you were hiding. "Now I'm tired of small," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, "about where I came from, about why I was moving when I got here." She'd been carrying it since January, the weight of the untold story, and she understood now that it had gotten heavy enough that carrying it alone was costing more than she could afford. "You don't," he started. "I know I don't have to," she said. "I want to." He turned slightly toward her, not facing her fully, not making it more formal than it needed to be, just present, the way he was present for things. She told him, not everything, not every detail, but the shape of it, the man in Billings and the paper, and the years of moving before and after, the thing that had happened in the spring that had started her moving again, the Northwest Pass, and the boots with the separating sole. She told it plainly, the way she told him things, without performing it or asking for a specific response. He listened without interrupting. The valley light changed around them. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. The man in Billings, he said carefully. Is he still a problem? Less than he was, she said. The legal matter was resolved last year. He still knows my name, but he doesn't have a claim anymore. And the thing in the spring. It's distant now, she said, far enough that I've stopped watching for it every day. He nodded slowly. She watched him hold the information the way he held things, carefully, without rushing to a response. Thank you for telling me, he said. You're not going to ask questions. Not tonight, he said. If there are things I need to know to be useful, tell me when you're ready. He paused. The rest of it is yours. She stood there for a moment with the weight she'd been carrying. Lighter now, not gone, but redistributed, shared in the way that things become when someone else knows they exist. Garrick, she said. Yes. I'm not leaving. He was quiet for a moment, then, I know. I wanted to say it directly. I heard you, he said. The light finished its change, and the valley settled into the particular blue of a clear spring evening, and they stood there, not quite touching, in a silence that had nothing in it that needed to be filled. Summer came to the Black Ridge Valley with a kind of generosity that the land hadn't shown in years. The grass came back in the eastern pastures first, not the thin, pale growth that had been passing for grass in the dry summers. But the real thing, dense and green and deep-rooted, the kind of grass that meant the soil underneath had remembered what it was supposed to do. The cattle moved into it and didn't move out again for days. Niall walked those pastures in the second week of June and came back to the ranch house with mud on his boots and an expression that was, for Niall, the equivalent of a man weeping with relief. It's good grass, he said. I know, Maeve said. No, I mean it's good grass, the kind we haven't had since I was a boy. She looked at him for a moment. He was not a man who overstated things. She nodded and went back to what she'd been doing, and she didn't say anything more about it because some things didn't need more said. The channel system ran through July without a significant problem. There were small adjustments, a section of bank on Purdy's land that needed reinforcing after a heavy rain in late June, a debris blockage at the secondary junction that Theo cleared in an afternoon, but the structure held, and the water moved, and the valley received what it had been running short on for 3 dry years running. The Tanner claim, still technically in probate, had water running through it for the first time since the family had abandoned it, and there was talk among several valley families about whether to petition for the land to be made available for settlement before winter. Maeve drafted the petition. Nobody asked her to. She did it because she'd been watching the land and thinking about what it needed, and what it needed was people who intended to stay. Garrick found the draft on the kitchen table one morning and read it without comment and then looked at her across the room. You wrote this last night, he said. This morning, she said, before anyone was up. It's good. It needs a second set of eyes on the legal language, she said. The territorial filing requirements for abandoned claim petitions are specific. I'd want Fenn to review it before it goes anywhere. I'll take it in Thursday, he said. She looked at him. There was something easy in the exchange. The particular ease of two people who had been operating alongside each other long enough that the coordination had stopped requiring negotiation. She noticed it and let herself notice it. Garrick, she said. Yes. The petition. It should go from the community, not from the ranch. It should have Voss's name on it and Haskell's. The more names, the better. He looked at the papers. You don't want your name on it. I want it to succeed, she said. That's not always the same thing. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you could put your name on it and it would still succeed. I know, she said. But Voss carries weight with the territorial office and I don't. Not yet. She paused. There's a difference between what I know I've built and what I need to prove to an office in the capital. He set the papers down. You know you don't have to keep proving things. I know, she said. And she meant it, mostly. The part of her that was still running the old calculations. The part that woke up some mornings and checked instinctively for exits, for reasons to move. That part had gotten quieter over the summer. But it hadn't gone completely silent, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Old habits take longer to change than situations do. Yes, he said, with a simplicity that told her he understood this from somewhere personal, and she didn't ask where. Untick. The crane business resolved itself in August in a way that was almost anticlimactic after the months of low-level tension it had produced. Harlan Crane came to the ranch alone, which was notable. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon without Dolph, without the expensive coat, and with the look of a man who had made a calculation and arrived at an answer he didn't entirely like but could live with. Garrick received him in the yard, and Maeve stayed on the porch, and Callum appeared in the barn doorway with the studied casualness of someone making themselves available without forcing the point. Harlan said he'd reviewed the survey findings and the water rights documentation and had consulted with a lawyer in the territorial capital. He said he wanted to discuss a formal acknowledgement of the eastern boundary as surveyed. Garrick said that was straightforward and asked what he needed. Harlan said a signed agreement between the two ranches, recorded at the land office, would close the matter. Garrick said he could have that by Friday. There was a pause in which both men looked at each other with the particular expression of people who had been positioned as adversaries and were adjusting to the absence of that structure. Harlan said, with some effort, "The water situation, what your family did, it benefited the Crane land too. We're in the same valley." Garrick said, "Yes." Another pause. "I wasn't easy to deal with," Harlan said. "It wasn't quite an apology. It was what it was." "No," Garrick said. "You weren't." Harlan looked at the ranch, the fences, the pastures, the repaired porch and the smoke from the chimney, and the general state of a property that had been attended to. His gaze moved briefly to Maeve on the porch, and then back to Garrick. "Friday," he said. "Friday," Garrick confirmed. Harlan rode out. Callum came out of the barn doorway and leaned against the post and said nothing for a moment. "That's it?" he said finally. "That's it," Garrick said. Callum considered this. "Feels like there should have been more to it." "Most things do," Garrick said, and came back inside. Maeve watched him come through the door. He looked at her with the expression he got when something that had been costing energy was finished costing it. Not relief exactly, more like a room where the furniture had been slightly wrong, and now was right. "It's done," she said. "Yes," he said. She turned back to the stove. "Maeve," he said. She turned. "Thank you," he said, "for the survey, the petition, the channels, for all of it." She looked at him for a moment. He had said it plainly, which was how he said things, and she received it plainly. "You gave me work when I had nothing," she said. "I think we're approximately even." "We're not," he said. "Garrick, we're not even," he said. "And I'm not saying that to put weight on you. I'm saying it because I'd rather say the true thing than the comfortable one." She stood in the kitchen with the stove going and the summer afternoon coming through the window and looked at him. This man who had opened a door to a stranger in December and had not once asked for more than she was prepared to give. "All right," she said. "We're not even." He nodded once and went out to find the others. She stood there for a moment longer, and she let herself feel the full weight of what had been given to her in this place. Not just work, not just safety, but the slower and more complicated gift of being known and not left. And she acknowledged it without explaining it away, and then she went back to what she'd been doing. It was Seb who noticed the letter first. It arrived on a Thursday in late August, addressed to Maeve in handwriting she recognized before she finished reading the return address. She took it from Seb's hand without expression and went to her room and sat on the edge of the bed and held it for a moment before opening it. The man from Billings. Not a threat. She'd been right in April. The legal matter was resolved. He had no claim. But there it was. His handwriting, his words on a page, reaching her here. She read it twice. It was short. He had heard she was in Black Ridge. He wanted her to know he had no intention of pursuing any further matter. He had remarried in the spring. She sat with it. She had spent 2 years with this man's name as a weight she carried. She had moved across 3 territories partly because of it. She had arrived in Black Ridge in December, partly because of the accumulated distance it had cost her to get away from the problem he represented. And now here it was. Not a threat, not a demand, just a letter that said, in the blunt language of a man who was not particularly good with words, that he was done with her in every sense. She should have felt relief. She did feel relief, somewhere under the other things. But what she mostly felt, sitting there with the letter, was a strange, suspended awareness of how many miles and months had been spent on something that had ended this quietly on a Thursday afternoon in August, in a room that was hers. She folded the letter and put it in the small wooden box where she kept the few things she'd carried with her from before. She sat for another moment. Then she went back out to the kitchen and finished making dinner. She told Garrick about the letter that evening because she had told him the shape of the story in May, and this was the ending of that shape, and he deserved to know the ending. She told him plainly, and he listened plainly, and then he said, "How are you?" "I'm all right," she said. "I know it's not a full answer," she said. "I'm working on it." She looked at the table. "I think I'm relieved and also angry at the years it cost, both at once." "That seems fair," he said. "It's not a clean feeling." "No," he said. "It wouldn't be." She looked at him. "Thank you for not telling me how I should feel about it." "I wouldn't know how you should feel," he said. "I only know you." She held that sentence for a moment, the quiet precision of it, the way it managed to be both a limited thing and a very large one. "That's enough," she said, knowing that. But the first hard frost of fall came in early October, and the valley met it differently than it had met the frosts of the previous 3 years. The water had done what water does. It had fed the soil, and the soil had fed the grass, and the grass had fed the cattle, and the cattle had come through the summer in better condition than any of the valley ranchers could remember seeing. The hay stores were full. The repair work on the channel system had been completed by September, including 2 sections that Purdy's eldest son had done himself without being asked, a fact that Maeve registered and did not comment on publicly, but noted. The valley was not fixed. She understood this. One good summer did not undo 3 dry ones, and the channel system required ongoing maintenance, and the question of who would sustain the community cooperation that had made the restoration possible was one that nobody had fully answered. Small places had short memories for shared effort and long memories for grievance. She knew that, but the capacity was there now, in the people who had worked alongside each other through the spring and summer, Haskell's men and the Rowan brothers, and Purdy's son and Clara Dawes's husband who had joined the second phase of clearing, the understanding that the valley could act as something other than a collection of competing interests. That understanding was fragile. It would need tending, the same way the channels needed tending. She was prepared to tend it. At the community meeting in September, smaller than the June one, more practical, organized around the maintenance schedule for the coming year, Voss asked if she would serve on the informal water committee that would oversee the channel system going forward. She said yes without hesitating. Then she added that Niles should be co-chair because he knew the land better than anyone, and because decisions about the system would be more durable if they came from someone the valley had grown up with. Niall, who had not been expecting this, looked at her across the schoolhouse room with the expression he got when she did something that surprised him. "You didn't ask me first," he said afterward. "Would you have said yes if I'd asked?" A pause. "Yes." "Then I saved us a conversation," she said. He shook his head, which was as close to laughing as Niall generally got. The thing she had not fully accounted for was the way that staying in a place changed the place in you. She'd thought in December and January that the ranch was temporary, that it was a place to stop moving, catch her breath, get back to something like functional before the next thing required her attention. She'd thought it with the part of herself that had learned to think in terms of exits and durations, and the careful management of how much you let a place matter. What she hadn't accounted for was what happened when a place started mattering anyway, around the edges of your defenses in ways too small to catch until they'd accumulated into something too large to dismiss. The kitchen that she had made into a kitchen. The accounts that ran in her handwriting now through the whole year's operation. The fence she'd fixed for Theo in the first month. The one small gesture that had told her something about what kind of person she still was underneath the years of managing alone. Callum's voice saying at the edge of the channel draw, "I'm sorry for whatever the price was." Seb's 23-year-old certainty. You can be seen for what you actually are. The boots by the door that were hers now, not a man's boots too large in the shoulders. She was sitting on the porch on an October evening, in the particular cold that was crisp rather than threatening, watching the last of the light leave the eastern pastures when Garrett came and sat in the other chair. He didn't say anything immediately, and neither did she. They'd gotten practiced at that. The silence that didn't require filling. After a while he said, "I want to ask you something." "All right," she said. "I want to ask you to stay, not as an employee." He said it looking at the pastures, not at her, and she understood that was not avoidance, but his particular brand of directness, the kind that required a certain stillness to deliver. "I've been trying to find a way to say it that isn't presumptuous, and I've decided there isn't one, so I'm just going to say it." She looked at the side of his face. "I'm not a simple person to be around," he said. "I know that. I'm not going to tell you this place is easy, or that the next winter won't be hard, or that there aren't going to be problems we can't anticipate." He paused. "But I'd like you here. Not because of what you can do, which is considerable, because of who you are, which is more considerable." He stopped. Started again, more simply. "I don't want you to leave." She sat with it. Not the question. She'd known, in some form, that this was where they were. Had known it since the spring. Maybe since earlier than that. What she sat with was the old reflex, the familiar tightening, the voice that said, "Be careful what you build here, because buildings can come down." She listened to it. She acknowledged it. She did not obey it. "I spent a long time," she said slowly, "believing that belonging to a place was a liability. That the more you had to lose, the more you'd lose." She looked at the pastures. "I've changed my mind about that." He turned and looked at her then. "I'm not easy either," she said. "I wake up some mornings and I still run the old inventory. Exits, risks, what I'd do if. I don't think that's going to stop completely." She met his eyes. "But I don't want to leave. I haven't wanted to leave in a long time. I just needed to be sure I was staying because I wanted to, not because I was too tired to run." "And?" he said. "I'm not tired," she said. I want to stay." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he turned back to the pastures, and something in his posture changed. A small release. The kind that comes when a thing you've been holding carefully can be set down. "All right," he said. "That's all?" she said. "What else should there be?" She almost laughed. It got out this time. Not much, just a sound, but real. "Nothing," she said. "Nothing else." They sat in the dark and cold together as the valley finished its settling into evening, and neither of them moved to go inside for a long time. Winter came back in November, as it always did. The first snow fell on a Sunday, and by Monday the valley was white, and the road to Black Ridge had gone quiet, and the ranch sealed itself into the familiar rhythm of the cold season. But it was different this time. Not in the large dramatic ways that made for stories, but in the small ways that are actually what living is made of. The house was a house. Not just functional. A house. The kind where things had been chosen and arranged and cared for by someone who intended to be there next year and the year after. The kitchen ran the way it ran because she'd learned what each of them needed and had been doing it long enough that it was second nature. The accounts were in order and told a story of a ranch that had come back from the edge of attrition and was now, carefully and without drama, building towards something more than just survival. Callum's chest held through the cold, in part because she'd started him on a preventive regimen in October that he'd initially resisted and eventually conceded was working. Bram's arm had healed cleanly. Theo finished his sentences. Seb remained relentlessly, exhaustingly himself, which was exactly what he was supposed to be. And Niall on a Tuesday evening in December came in from the first serious snow of the season and stood in the kitchen doorway, dripping and red-faced, and said, "The east pasture water inlet is solid. We're going to have to clear it by hand in the mornings until the temperature comes up." "I know," Maeve said. "I put the tools next to the barn door last week." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Of course you did," and sat down and pulled off his boots. And that was that. That. There is something that the frontier teaches, if you live in it long enough and stay still enough to learn it. It teaches that survival and belonging are not the same thing, that a person can endure almost anything alone and still be impoverished in a way that's hard to name until you've experienced its opposite. Maeve Ashcroft had spent 2 years being very good at surviving. What she learned in Black Ridge, slowly and without being able to point to the moment it changed, was the difference between enduring and being alive. She had arrived with nothing she was willing to show anyone. She had stayed because the cold made moving dangerous, and a man had opened a door without asking for a reason. And then she had stayed because the kitchen needed someone, and the accounts were a mess and there were channels under the valley that nobody else could see. And then she had stayed because she had put her name on something real and there were people who knew it. She had stayed finally because this was home. Not a place she'd come from, not a place she'd landed temporarily, but a place she had helped make into itself. In the end, that was the thing she hadn't expected. Not that someone would see her clearly and choose her. Not that a valley full of strangers would accept her work and eventually her presence. But that belonging, real belonging, the difficult and imperfect kind, required her to risk being seen before she was certain it was safe. That the safety came after, not before, and you could wait your whole life for it to come first, and it never would. She thought about this sometimes, in the early mornings before anyone else was up, standing at the kitchen window with her coffee, looking at the frost on the eastern pastures and the channel inlet markers she'd driven into the ground in October, and the slow light coming over the hills that held, somewhere under them, a spring that had been running quietly in the dark all along. She had been like that spring, she thought, running in the dark, finding no channel. The channel had been there too. It had only needed clearing. Outside, the snow came down on the valley that was hers, and the house behind her was full of people who were hers. And the woman who had arrived in December with a separating boot sole and a name she no longer used stood in her own kitchen in her own home and watched the morning come in over the mountains and felt, with the complicated and imperfect fullness of someone who had earned it the hard way, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be.